Let me be direct with you from the outset. What Saudi Arabia announced yesterday was not a pause in normalization talks. It was not a diplomatic delay or a request for better terms. What Saudi Arabia announced was the complete suspension of all discussions regarding diplomatic recognition of Israel, the cancellation of planned economic integration agreements, and the withdrawal from frameworks that would have made Saudi Arabia the centerpiece of expanded Abraham Accords. I am looking at the official statement released by the Saudi Ministry of Foreign Affairs at 11:34 a.m. Riyadh time on April 16th. What this statement says, in carefully crafted diplomatic language that nonetheless carries unmistakable meaning, is that Saudi Arabia will not proceed with normalization of relations with Israel under current circumstances, and that the Palestinian question must be resolved in accordance with international law and Arab Peace Initiative parameters before any such discussions can resume. In the next 20 minutes, I am going to walk you through exactly why this announcement represents the collapse of American Middle East strategy for the past 4 years, why the Abraham Accords framework that was celebrated as a historic realignment is now fragmenting under the weight of realities that were always present but were ignored, and why Saudi Arabia's decision has implications for American influence across the entire region that go far beyond one failed diplomatic initiative. This is the Daily Brief. Subscribe now if you have not already, because what we are covering is based on internal Saudi decision-making processes that have been reported by sources with direct access to senior officials in Riyadh. Let's start with what the Abraham Accords were supposed to accomplish, because understanding the original strategic vision tells you everything about why that vision is now collapsing. The Abraham Accords, signed in 2020, established diplomatic relations between Israel and the United Arab Emirates and subsequently Bahrain, Morocco, and Sudan. The framework was presented as a new paradigm for Middle Eastern relations, where Arab states would normalize ties with Israel based on shared interests, particularly regarding Iran, without requiring resolution of the Palestinian conflict first. The strategic logic was straightforward. Arab states care more about Iranian threat, economic development, and technological partnerships than they care about Palestinian statehood. Israel offers intelligence cooperation against Iran, advanced technology, and access to American political support. The Palestinians, in this framework, were told that their cause would be better served by Arab states having leverage over Israel through normal relations rather than remaining isolated and confrontational. Saudi Arabia was always the ultimate prize. If the Saudis, who control Islam's two holiest sites and wield enormous influence across the Muslim world, recognized Israel, that would legitimize normalization for dozens of other Muslim-majority nations. The Abraham Accords would expand from a handful of Gulf states into a comprehensive regional realignment that isolated Iran and gave Israel acceptance across the Middle East it had sought since 1948. American diplomacy under both Trump and Biden administrations worked toward this objective. Hundreds of hours of negotiations, security guarantees offered to Saudi Arabia, advanced weapons sales approved, civil nuclear cooperation discussed. The pressure was immense, and until yesterday, the assumption in Washington and Tel Aviv was that Saudi Arabia would eventually agree because the benefits were too significant to refuse. That assumption was wrong. Subscribe if you are watching this and realizing that the Middle East you have been told is evolving toward Israeli integration is actually moving in the opposite direction. Announcement number 1, the Saudi decision was not driven by the Palestinian issue alone. And this one matters more than the official statement suggests, because it reveals a complete reassessment of Saudi strategic interests that goes far beyond solidarity with Palestinians. According to reporting by Middle East Eye and confirmed by Saudi sources speaking to Al Monitor, the decision to suspend normalization talks was driven by 4 factors that converged over the past 6 months. The Palestinian issue is one factor, but it is not the dominant one. Factor 1, Chinese diplomatic influence. China brokered the Saudi-Iran rapprochement in March 2023, which was supposed to be impossible. That success demonstrated to Saudi leadership that China could deliver diplomatic outcomes in the region that America could not or would not deliver. And critically, China made clear to Saudi Arabia that Saudi-Israel normalization would complicate Chinese-Saudi relations at a time when China is Saudi Arabia's largest oil customer and a critical partner in Vision 2030 economic diversification plans. Factor 2, Russian energy coordination. Saudi Arabia and Russia manage global oil markets through OPEC+ arrangements that require continuous coordination. Russia made clear that Saudi-Israeli normalization would be viewed as alignment with Western Bloc in ways that would complicate that coordination. Saudi Arabia depends on Russian cooperation to maintain oil prices that fund government spending and development projects. Factor 3, regional security reassessment. Saudi Arabia watched Israeli operations in Gaza over the past year and drew conclusions about Israeli reliability as a security partner. If Israel cannot achieve decisive outcomes against Hamas despite overwhelming military superiority, what value does Israeli security partnership provide against Iran, which is far more capable than Hamas? Saudi military planners assess that Israeli security guarantees might not be as valuable as American diplomats claimed. Factor 4. Domestic political constraints. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman can push through many controversial decisions, but normalizing relations with Israel while images of Palestinian casualties circulate on Saudi social media creates internal political pressures that even MBS cannot easily manage. The Saudi public, particularly younger Saudis who are the demographic MBS depends on for Vision 2030, are far more opposed to Israeli normalization than American diplomats assumed. These four factors together created a decision environment where the costs of normalization exceeded the benefits, and where Saudi leadership concluded that their interests were better served by maintaining current position than by proceeding with an agreement that would alienate China, Russia, their own population, and potentially leave them committed to a security partnership with Israel that might not deliver the promised benefits. Received. That is announcement number 1. Announcement number 2, the Abraham Accords are not collapsing because Saudi Arabia withdrew. They are collapsing because the original states that signed them are quietly downgrading the relationships. This is the part Western media is not covering. According to investigative reporting by Haaretz and confirmed by diplomatic sources in Abu Dhabi and Manama, the UAE and Bahrain have both significantly reduced their diplomatic and economic engagement with Israel over the past 8 months. Trade volumes that were projected to grow exponentially have plateaued or declined. Joint technology ventures that were announced with great fanfare have been quietly shelved. Diplomatic exchanges that were supposed to deepen cooperation have become ceremonial rather than substantive. Stay with me, because this is where you see the difference between signing an agreement and actually implementing the relationship the agreement was supposed to create. The UAE and Bahrain signed the Abraham Accords in 2020, but the depth and warmth of the relationship was always contingent on continued American pressure to maintain the partnership and on the belief that the benefits would materialize quickly enough to justify the political costs of normalization. 6 years later, those benefits have not materialized as promised. Israeli technology partnerships have been limited. Security cooperation has been minimal. And critically, the Palestinian issue that was supposed to fade into irrelevance has instead become more prominent and more politically costly for Arab leaders who normalized relations. Emirati officials, speaking privately to journalists, have expressed frustration that Israel did not use the normalization to advance Palestinian statehood or even to freeze settlement expansion in the West Bank. The explicit expectation in Abu Dhabi was that normalization would give them leverage over Israeli policy. That leverage has not materialized. What has materialized is domestic criticism from Emirati citizens who view normalization as betrayal of Palestinian cause. Bahrain faces even more severe domestic pressures. Bahrain has a majority Shia population governed by a Sunni monarchy. That population is deeply opposed to Israeli normalization. Maintaining the relationship requires internal security measures that are politically costly and that risk destabilizing a country that is already fragile. Morocco and Sudan, the other Abraham Accord signatories, have barely implemented their agreements. Morocco normalized primarily to gain American recognition of its sovereignty over Western Sahara. Sudan normalized as part of a deal to be removed from the American terrorism list. Neither country has developed meaningful relations with Israel beyond the bare minimum required by the agreements they signed. Announcement number 3, and this is what reveals the complete failure of American strategy. The collapse of Saudi normalization is not happening in isolation. It is happening simultaneously with declining American influence across the Middle East on every major issue. Saudi Arabia and Iran restored diplomatic relations through Chinese mediation, not American. Syria is being reintegrated into the Arab League over American objections. The Gulf states are pursuing independent relationships with Russia and China that operate outside American frameworks. Egypt is deepening ties with BRICS nations. Turkey is pursuing its own agenda in Syria and Libya with minimal regard for American preferences. The pattern is clear. American ability to shape Middle Eastern outcomes through diplomatic pressure, security guarantees, and economic incentives is declining. The Abraham Accords were supposed to be the centerpiece of a new American-led regional order. Instead, they are becoming a historical footnote to a period of American overreach where Washington believed it could reshape regional alignments without addressing the underlying conflicts and interests that drive those alignments. And here is the element that makes this particularly damaging to American credibility. The Biden administration invested enormous political capital in Saudi normalization. Secretary of State Blinken made multiple trips to Riyadh. National Security Advisor Sullivan coordinated directly with Saudi leadership. President Biden himself engaged with Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman despite his previous statements about making Saudi Arabia a pariah over the Khashoggi killing. All of that investment, all of those compromises on American values, all of that diplomatic effort has produced exactly zero results. Saudi Arabia is not normalizing relations with Israel. America did not get the regional realignment it sought. And America demonstrated to every Middle Eastern capital that even when Washington commits its most senior officials to an objective, it cannot deliver outcomes if regional actors decide their interests lie elsewhere. Received. That is announcement number 3. Now let's talk about what is really happening behind the diplomatic statements, because the official Saudi explanation about Palestinian concerns is true but incomplete. The real story is about Saudi Arabia making a strategic choice to prioritize relations with China and Russia over relations with America and Israel. The public narrative is that Saudi Arabia remains committed to normalization in principle but cannot proceed while Palestinian suffering continues. The statement expresses hope that future conditions might allow resumption of discussions. This is diplomatic language designed to avoid burning bridges with Washington while explaining the decision to the Saudi public and the broader Arab world. The private reality is that Saudi strategic planning has fundamentally shifted over the past 3 years. Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman has concluded that Saudi Arabia's future prosperity depends on economic integration with Asia, not deeper alignment with American and European powers whose influence in global affairs is declining relative to rising powers in the East. Saudi Arabia's largest oil customer is China. Saudi Arabia's largest source of construction and infrastructure investment is China. Saudi Arabia's most important technology partnerships for Vision 2030 are with Chinese companies. And critically, China does not lecture Saudi Arabia about human rights or demand political reforms as conditions for economic cooperation. Russia is Saudi Arabia's partner in managing oil markets. Russian cooperation is essential for maintaining prices. Russian positions on regional security issues align more closely with Saudi interests than American positions do. And Russia, like China, does not condition cooperation on internal Saudi political choices. Think carefully about what this represents. Saudi Arabia is choosing partners based on who can deliver economic and security benefits without imposing political costs. American and Israel cannot compete in that framework because American cooperation comes with demands for political alignment, human rights improvements, and support for policies like Israeli normalization that create domestic political problems for Saudi leadership. If you are a Saudi citizen watching your government's choices, what is happening is not about Palestinians specifically. It is about your leadership deciding that Saudi Arabia's interests are better served by partnerships with countries that respect Saudi sovereignty and don't demand that Saudi Arabia choose between its economic interests and its political values. This pattern has historical precedents, and every time it repeats, the outcome is the same. Smaller powers shift alignments away from declining hegemons toward rising powers when the rising powers offer better terms. Consider the late Ottoman Empire and the great power competition for influence in the Middle East in the decades before World War I. The Ottoman Empire was declining. Britain and France competed for influence by offering loans, infrastructure investments, and political support. But those offers always came with conditions, concessions, and demands for internal reforms. When Germany entered the competition offering investments without political conditions, offering military cooperation without demanding territorial concessions, Ottoman leadership found German partnership more attractive despite Britain and France being the dominant global powers. The parallel is not exact, but the principle is identical. Saudi Arabia today is like the Ottoman Empire evaluating competing offers from great powers. American offers come with conditions, demands for internal changes, pressure to normalize with Israel despite domestic opposition. Chinese and Russian offers come with fewer strings attached and respect for Saudi decision-making autonomy. Given that choice, Saudi leadership is choosing the partnerships that maximize their freedom of action. So where does this leave us? Let me give you 3 paths forward, because what happens next will determine whether America can salvage any version of its Middle East strategy or whether we are witnessing a fundamental realignment that reduces American influence across the region for a generation. Path 1, America doubles down on pressure. Washington offers Saudi Arabia security guarantees, advanced weapons, civil nuclear cooperation, and other incentives so compelling that MBS recalculates and proceeds with normalization despite the costs. This would require America making commitments that Congress might not approve, that would strain relations with Iran and potentially with China, and that would validate a model where American influence depends on constantly increasing the price it is willing to pay for cooperation. Probability, given current American domestic political constraints and Saudi reassessment of strategic interests, 10%. Path 2, managed decline of Abraham Accords. American accepts that Saudi normalization is not happening in the near term, works to maintain existing agreements with UAE and Bahrain at minimal levels, and shifts focus to other regional initiatives that do not depend on Arab-Israeli normalization. This is the path of least resistance that accepts strategic failure while avoiding additional political costs. Probability 60%. Path 3, complete strategic reorientation. American acknowledges that its Middle East strategy for the past 2 decades has failed, that attempting to build regional order around Israeli integration is not viable, and that American interests require a fundamentally different approach that prioritizes great power competition with China and Russia over legacy commitments to regional realignment. This would require political courage that is rare in Washington and would trigger fierce domestic opposition from pro-Israel constituencies. Probability 30%, and only if a new administration fundamentally rethinks Middle East policy. I think we are on path 2, which means American is choosing managed decline over honest reassessment. That is the politically safe choice. But it is also the choice that guarantees continued erosion of American influence as regional actors increasingly make decisions without reference to American preferences. Here's what I am watching: Chinese diplomatic activity in the Middle East over the next 90 days. If you see Chinese officials making high-profile visits to Riyadh, Abu Dhabi, and Cairo, if you see announcements of major new economic agreements or security cooperation frameworks, that tells you China is consolidating the gains from Saudi Arabia's decision and expanding its influence while American influence contracts. Also watch American rhetoric towards Saudi Arabia. If American officials begin criticizing MBS publicly, if weapons sales are delayed or reconsidered, if the relationship cools noticeably, that tells you Washington is responding to this failure with frustration and retaliation rather than strategic adjustment. If American maintains warm relations and continues engagement, that tells you Washington is hoping this is temporary and that continued patience will eventually produce the normalization they seek. Here are the questions I want you to take away. Can American maintain influence in the Middle East without the ability to deliver major diplomatic agreements like Saudi-Israeli normalization? Can Saudi Arabia balance relations with American, China, and Russia without eventually being forced to choose sides in great power competition? And can the Abraham Accords survive as anything more than historical curiosity if the agreements are not implemented meaningfully and if the framework does not expand? Tell me in the comments whether you think Saudi Arabia ever normalizes with Israel or whether this decision is permanent given the trajectory of global power shifts. Tell me if you believe American can adapt its Middle East strategy to this new reality, or if we are watching the end of American as the dominant external power in the region. We will keep tracking every development as the implications of this decision ripple across regional diplomacy and as other Arab states reconsider their own positions on Israeli normalization. Subscribe now. Share this analysis with everyone trying to understand why Saudi Arabia's decision matters for American foreign policy and for the future of the Middle East regional order. Turn on notifications because the next major development, whether it is another Abraham Accord state downgrading relations or China announcing a new Middle East initiative, will tell us everything about whether this is a temporary setback for American strategy or a permanent shift in regional alignments. We will be here to explain exactly what it means when it happens. We will see you in the next analysis.